Brace. She was beaten and abused for 3 years by white men, until I heard her forbidden cry. Amara had always been a quiet girl, the kind who noticed things others didn't. She lived in a small town where everyone thought they knew each other, where the streets were lined with tall trees that swayed gently in the wind, and where children played freely in the afternoon sun. But life there seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful, as if nothing bad could ever happen in a place so calm. But Amara knew that even in quiet towns, shadows could hide in the corners. From the moment she could remember, Amara had loved stories. She would sit by the window of her small bedroom, her feet dangling over the edge of the chair, and watch the world outside while imagining worlds far beyond her town. She imagined herself as a brave heroine, someone who could face danger and never back down. She had a small notebook where she wrote her dreams and the adventures she wanted to have one day. Those stories gave her hope, and they gave her strength, even when life sometimes felt lonely. Her family was loving but busy. Her mother worked long hours at a nearby factory, and her father often traveled for work. Her older brother was away at college most of the year. So Amara learned to rely on herself, to find comfort in her imagination and the few friends she had at school. School was one of her favorite places, not because she loved studying, though she did, but because it was a place where she could feel alive. She enjoyed the laughter of her friends, the feeling of holding a pencil and writing something meaningful, and the small victories of learning something new. Teachers often noticed her quiet intelligence. She wasn't the loudest or the most outgoing, but there was a spark in her eyes that made people want to know more about her. Despite her calm demeanor, Amara sometimes felt a strange unease. There were people in her town who smiled politely but gave her chills with the way they looked at her. Sometimes strangers would linger near the school gates or stand too long outside her favorite shops. Mother would tell her not to worry, that everyone was busy with their own lives, but Amara couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching, always waiting. It was a feeling she didn't fully understand, and she kept it to herself because she didn't want to worry anyone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Amara walked home from the library carrying her backpack filled with books. She had stayed late to read because a story had captivated her, a story about courage and survival. She didn't notice the man standing near the corner of the street until she was almost past him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes that made him seem like a shadow. But it was not a friendly smile. It was a smile that made her stomach twist with discomfort. She tried to ignore him and walked faster, but he moved in the same direction she was going. Her heart began to race. She considered turning back or running, but the street was empty and the library was already closing. She felt trapped, a feeling she had never experienced before. For the first time, the stories she had loved about brave heroines seemed distant. She wanted to be brave, but fear rooted her to the ground. The man's eyes followed her, and for a moment she wondered if he was going to call out to her or step closer. Then, almost as suddenly as he appeared, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. That night, Amara told herself that it was just her imagination, that she was overthinking everything. She closed her notebook, blew out the candle, and tried to sleep. But the feeling of being watched stayed with her. Even in her dreams, she felt a presence lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She woke up several times that night, checking the window and the street below, but everything seemed normal. Days passed, and life seemed to return to its ordinary rhythm. School continued, the library remained a sanctuary, and her friends chatted about their own small adventures. But the memory of that man lingered like a shadow over her mind. Amara couldn't explain why, but she felt that the world had shifted slightly, that something dark was waiting just beyond the edge of her vision. It was during a weekend, when her parents were busy with work and her brother was away, that the danger arrived. She had gone to the small market near her street to buy ingredients for her mother's dinner. The sun was bright, and the market was busy with people laughing, shouting, and selling their goods. She walked carefully, holding her bag close, and keeping an eye out for anyone who seemed out of place. But she didn't notice the van parked a little farther down the street, or the men sitting inside, watching her every move. As she stepped onto the corner to cross the street, one of the men opened the door and grabbed her, spraying. The world spun in confusion and fear. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the noise of the market. People walked past, pretending not to see. Panic surged through her body, a wave of fear she had never known before. She struggled and kicked, trying to free herself. But the man was strong, and she was small. The van door closed, and everything went dark, bare. Inside the van, Amara felt a cold shock of reality. She was no longer in her safe town, no longer in the world she knew. The men spoke to each other in low voices, and she realized quickly that they had been planning this, watching her for days. Fear threatened to paralyze her, but somewhere deep inside a small spark of determination remained. She remembered the stories in her notebook, the heroines she had written about, and she made a silent promise to herself. She would survive, no matter what. The journey seemed endless. The van took her through unfamiliar roads, through forests and empty fields, places she had never seen before. She tried to memorize landmarks, to find a way to escape, but the men were always watching. They never let her out of their sight. Amara's mind raced with questions. Why was this happening? But she realized that asking questions would not save her. Only careful thought, patience, and courage could give her a chance. At last, they stopped at an isolated house, surrounded by high fences and thick woods. The men pulled her inside and told her to be quiet. The house was dark, with heavy curtains and locked doors. Amara realized that she was trapped, that the life she had known was gone, at least for now. But even in that darkness, she clung to hope. She looked around for anything she could use, anything that could help her if she needed to escape. She observed the men, noting their habits, the times they left rooms, and the small details that might one day help her. Days turned into weeks, and Amara learned to hide her fear, to appear calm even when her heart raced. She watched the men carefully, noticing patterns and weaknesses. She refused to give up. In her mind, she created secret places, imaginary rooms where she could go to feel safe, to remind herself that she was more than just a prisoner. She continued writing in her notebook whenever she could, scribbling stories of courage and survival, stories that reminded her that one day she would be free.
Even in the darkest moments, Amara refused to give in completely.
She found small ways to resist, to remind herself of who she was. A glance at a familiar picture, a whispered memory of her family, or the touch of sunlight through a window. All these small things kept her connected to the world outside. And slowly she began to understand that survival was not just about escaping the men, it was about holding on to herself, her spirit, and her hope. As the third year of her captivity began, Amara's mind was sharper than ever. She noticed every detail, every sound, every habit of the men who kept her confined. Her heart ached for her family and the world she had lost, but she never let despair take over. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that one day someone would hear her forbidden cry. Someone who could bring her back to life, back to freedom. Even in those first days, after the world had turned upside down, Amara understood something important. Fear could not break her completely. Hope, courage, and careful planning were her weapons. She vowed silently to herself that she would survive, no matter how long it took, no matter how impossible it seemed. And so, Amara waited. Bah. She watched. She planned. She remembered who she was and who she wanted to be. Little did she know that, one day, a single moment, a cry, a sound, a desperate plea, would change everything. But for now, she remained hidden in the shadows, a quiet observer of a world that had taken her from everything she loved, yet had not yet taken her spirit. Time moved slowly inside the dark, isolated house. Days and nights blurred together, marked only by the sounds of the men moving through the rooms and the occasional sunlight that seeped through heavy curtains. Amara had learned quickly that fear could not save her. Only careful observation and patience could. She studied every corner of the house, every door and window, noting which locks clicked easily, which floors creaked under weight, and even the habits of the men who had taken her. At first the days felt endless. She would sit in silence, staring at the walls, imagining the world beyond the house, the streets of her town, the sound of laughter from her friends, her mother's gentle voice, her father's calm presence. Both memories were both a comfort and a source of pain, reminding her of what she had lost. But slowly Amara realized that clinging to memories was not enough. She had to find ways to survive in the moment, to keep her mind sharp and her spirit strong. She began by observing. One man would always leave the kitchen door unlocked for exactly 3 minutes before returning. Another would pace the hallway while talking to himself. Amara memorized every pattern, every small detail. She knew that the smallest misstep on her part could be dangerous. So she moved quietly, speaking only when spoken to, and always keeping her eyes and ears alert. Even in this terrifying new world, her mind became her strongest weapon. The men were cruel, but not without routine. They often yelled and threatened, trying to make Amara afraid, to force her into silence and obedience. And though their words were harsh, she learned to separate the fear they tried to instill from her own sense of self. She told herself that no matter what they said or did, they could never touch the person she was inside. That person, the girl who loved stories, who dreamed of freedom, who believed in hope, remained untouched. To cope, Amara created small routines for herself. She counted the steps between rooms, memorized the layout of the house, and recited stories she had written in her notebook in her head. Sometimes she whispered them softly, imagining an audience that could never see her. These small acts of mental escape were her secret rebellion. They reminded her that she was more than just a prisoner. She was a mind that could think, imagine, and plan. Even in the darkest moments, Amara found ways to resist. She refused to cry when the men expected it, refused to let them see her despair. Sometimes when she was left alone, she would touch her notebook hidden under her mattress and imagine the outside world. She remembered the feeling of the sun on her face, the smell of flowers in her town, the sound of laughter that had once filled her afternoons. These memories became her lifeline, a thread connecting her to the person she still was, even in captivity. There were moments when despair threatened to overwhelm her. She missed her family with a sharpness that hurt physically. Breaths. She longed for the safety of her own home, the warmth of her bed, the comfort of familiar voices. Tears would sometimes escape, sliding silently down her cheeks when no one was watching. But each time, she reminded herself that crying alone was not weakness. It was a release, a way to keep her mind clear and her body ready to act when the opportunity came. Amara also began paying attention to the men's conversations. But she learned their names, their routines, and even their fears. One of them was careless when he thought no one was listening, muttering about money, debts, and problems he wanted to avoid. Another boasted loudly, trying to impress the others, but he had weaknesses that Amara noticed. She knew that understanding them, studying their strengths and weaknesses, could be her key to survival. Knowledge, she realized, was power, even when her body felt trapped. Sometimes she found moments of quiet courage in the smallest things. She would stand by the window and watch the trees sway in the wind, imagining that she could feel the breeze on her skin. She would press her hand against the walls, feeling the texture, the coolness, imagining she was reaching through to the other side. These moments were tiny sparks of freedom, reminders that the world outside still existed, and that she could one day return to it. Her mind also wandered to the idea of escape. She could not act yet. The men were too alert, and any misstep could be disastrous. But she planned silently, step by step. She memorized the locations of keys, doors, and windows. She imagined the route she could take, the times when the men were least careful, and the ways she could move without being noticed. Each day she added a new detail to her mental map, building a plan she hoped could one day save her. In addition to her mental exercises, Amara found ways to protect herself emotionally. She gave herself small goals: to survive one more day, to keep her mind sharp, to remember that she was not alone in spirit. She whispered to herself that she was brave, even when her body trembled. She reminded herself that fear was natural, but it could not define her. Each act of quiet courage was a statement to herself. I will not let them break me. Even in this terrifying environment, Amara's imagination became her sanctuary. She would close her eyes and imagine herself walking freely through her town, laughing with friends and holding her mother's hand. She imagined herself reading her stories aloud to an audience, telling tales of adventure and courage. In her mind, she was free, strong, and alive, and those moments, though brief, kept her spirit unbroken. Rest. Amara also began observing herself in ways she never had before. She noticed how her body reacted to stress, how her mind focused under pressure, and how she could control her emotions when needed. Every fear, every moment of pain became a lesson in resilience. She was learning to survive not just physically but mentally, to stay strong even when the world around her was cruel. As weeks turned into months, she discovered an inner rhythm to her days. She would rise early when the men slept, moving quietly to memorize details of the house. She would spend hours in silent observation, listening to footsteps, studying voices, and noting habits. She began keeping track of small events, creating a mental journal that would one day help her recount everything with clarity. But discipline, though small, became a source of strength and hope. Despite everything, Amara never lost hope. But she remembered the stories she had loved as a child, stories of people overcoming impossible odds, stories of courage and resilience. She believed that even in the darkest situations there was always a chance for light. And though she could not see it yet, she felt that one day someone would hear her cry, a cry she had never dared to let escape fully, and help her find the freedom she longed for. She practiced patience. She understood that survival was not about rushing, but about careful thought and endurance. Every day she stayed alive, every day she observed, and every day she maintained her spirit brought her closer to the moment when she could act. She began to understand that time, though long and cruel, was also her ally. Patience and observation could become her weapons. Even in the quietest moments, fear lingered. The men were unpredictable, and danger could appear suddenly. But Amara learned to accept fear as part of her life, using it as a guide rather than a prison. When fear struck, she took deep breaths, focused on her surroundings, and reminded herself that she was stronger than the situation around her. She learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. By the end of the 3rd year, Amara had changed in ways she could barely describe. She was no longer the quiet girl who had walked home from the library without fear. She had grown in courage, awareness, and patience. Though her body was trapped, her mind was free. She had become a keen observer, a silent planner, and a quiet survivor. And deep in her heart, she carried the unshakable belief that one day she would find a way out. The spark of hope inside her had never dimmed. It was fragile, yes, but it burned steadily, like a candle in the darkness. She knew that the day someone would hear her cry, someone would understand her pain, was coming. Until that day, she would endure. She would watch, plan, and wait. And she would never, not once, allow the men to take away her sense of self. Amara had learned the most important lesson of all, that true strength does not come from escaping immediately, but from surviving long enough to find the right moment to reclaim freedom. And though she did not yet know when that moment would come, she was ready. She was alive, and that was the first victory. Amara had been living in silence for 3 long years, each day blending into the next, each moment defined by fear and careful observation. But one morning, as the sun barely peeked through the thick curtains, she felt a shift in her spirit. Something inside her stirred, a quiet, desperate need to reach beyond the walls, beyond the darkness, beyond the fear. She had stayed hidden, silent and careful for so long, but today her heart pushed her toward action. She moved slowly through the house, her footsteps barely making a sound on the cold floor. The men were distracted, arguing over something trivial, a lost piece of paper, a mistake one of them had made, and Amara saw an opportunity. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her head steady. She whispered softly to herself, "I must try. I must reach someone." It was a tiny sound, almost swallowed by the walls around her, but it carried all her hope, all her courage. Outside on the street a few blocks away lived a man named Daniel. He was a quiet, thoughtful person, known in the neighborhood for noticing things others ignored. He would walk his dog early every morning, passing the empty streets before most people woke up. That morning, as he strolled along the familiar routes, something unusual caught his attention, a faint, muffled sound, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. At first he thought it was the wind moving through the trees or a neighbor practicing a song. But there was a strange urgency to it, a tone of distress that made him stop and listen. Breath. Daniel paused, holding the leash tightly in his hand. He tilted his head, focusing on the sound. Breath. It was soft, fragile, and yet desperate, a sound that seemed to plead for help without actually forming words. His heart quickened. Someone's in trouble, he thought. He could not be sure, but something inside him told him this was no ordinary sound. He scanned the nearby houses, looking for movement, but everything seemed still. The sound came again, the faint cry reaching him, like a small spark in the silence. Back in the house, Amara knew the risk she was taking. If the men noticed, she could be punished severely.
Yet the need to be heard was stronger than the fear that gripped her. She whispered again, letting her voice tremble but carry her words outward.
"Help, please." It was a tiny cry, almost swallowed by the walls, but it was enough to travel beyond them, enough to pierce the silence that had imprisoned her for so long. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He turned, trying to trace the direction of the sound. It came from a house at the end of the street, one that had always seemed quiet and ordinary. He approached cautiously, keeping his dog close and his senses alert. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. It was not the sound of someone playing a trick or rehearsing. This was real, and it was urgent. Inside the house, Samara held her breath, counting the seconds. She could hear the men moving in another room, arguing and unaware of her actions. She whispered again, louder this time, letting her voice carry every ounce of fear, hope, and determination she had inside her. "Please, someone, help me!" Her words trembled but did not break. These. Each whisper was a thread reaching out, hoping someone would grasp it, someone would understand. Daniel reached the front of the house, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. Bah! He circled the house, looking for any signs of life beyond the ordinary. The windows were heavy with curtains, and the doors were locked, but he noticed subtle movements, tiny shadows shifting inside, a flicker that didn't belong. Then he heard it clearly, the fragile, desperate sound of a young woman's voice. "Help! Please!" His stomach dropped, and he knew he had found something serious. He called out softly, "Hello? Are you okay in there?" There was a pause, and then, faintly, he heard it again. A whisper of hope, a cry for help that cut through the fear like a spark in the dark. Daniel's mind raced. He could not wait. He ran back to his house to grab his phone and called the authorities, explaining quickly but clearly what he had heard. Right. While he spoke, he kept listening, hoping the sound would not vanish, praying that it was not too late. Amara, hearing the faint acknowledgement from outside, felt a surge of hope. Her heart pounded as she realized that someone had heard her, that her cry, forbidden and dangerous as it was, had reached the outside world. She felt a mixture of fear and relief, knowing the men could notice at any moment. But the realization that she was not entirely alone, that someone cared enough to act, strengthened her resolve. The men began to suspect something was wrong. One of them approached the room, frowning at the faint movement he thought he saw. Amara held her breath, pressing herself against the wall, pretending to be asleep or still. The seconds dragged into minutes, each one testing her patience and courage. But Daniel's presence outside, and his determination to help, were the lifeline she had been waiting for. Daniel stayed close, keeping the authorities updated while observing the house. He noticed small details, the locked doors, the heavy curtains, the shadows inside. He tried to remain calm, but his mind raced with concern for the young woman inside. He imagined what she must be feeling. Fear, desperation, and yet a spark of hope that had reached him. He knew he could not waste a single moment. Inside, Amara's thoughts were a mix of terror and cautious optimism. She whispered quietly, "Please, don't leave me, please." Each word was a small act of bravery, a defiance of the years she had spent in silence, disgrace. She knew that if she remained patient and careful, someone would find a way to reach her. The cry she had held inside for so long had finally escaped, and now it was a lifeline. Minutes later, she heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. Relief and anxiety surged together. She knew the men would react, and she had to stay quiet, stay alert, and trust that the people outside could intervene. The sirens grew louder, and the men began to panic, realizing that something was happening. They rushed through the house, shouting, but Amara stayed hidden, silent, and ready to act when the moment came. Daniel guided the authorities, pointing out the house and explaining the urgency. Every second counted. Inside, Amara felt her heart pound as the men grew more frantic, unaware that help was on the way. She whispered once more, just to reassure herself. "I can do this! Stay strong!" Her words, though quiet, carried the power of 3 years of endurance and hope. Soon the police arrived, moving carefully to enter the house. Daniel watched from a safe distance, staying in contact, guiding them as best he could. Amara, hearing the sounds of movement, knew that her long years of silence were about to end. The fear was still present, but it was tempered by an overwhelming sense of hope. Help was near. She was not alone anymore. When the authorities finally reached her, Amara's eyes filled with tears, tears of relief, tears of disbelief, tears of survival. She had endured so much, but her forbidden cry had been heard. The spark she had held inside for 3 long years had become a lifeline, guiding someone from the outside into her world of darkness. The men were caught, their control over her finally broken. As she stepped outside into the sunlight, blinking and trembling, she felt a mixture of fear, relief, and freedom. The air smelled different, fresh, alive, full of possibility. The world she had imagined in her mind during years of captivity now stretched before her, real and full of hope. Daniel stood nearby, watching quietly, a witness to the bravery she had shown in silence. Amara realized in that moment that her courage had carried her through the darkest times. The forbidden cry, the act of reaching out despite fear, had changed everything. She had survived, and help had found her when she needed it most. The world was waiting for her, and though healing would take time, the first step had been taken. For the first time in years, she felt safe, not just from the men who had controlled her, but from the fear that had gripped her for so long. Her cry had been heard, her life had been acknowledged, and her journey toward freedom and recovery had begun.
Amar's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst.
She had heard the footsteps approaching, the voices of the men shouting in panic, and the faint but unmistakable sounds of officers outside. Everything she had endured for 3 long years had led to this moment. Pressed against the wall, every muscle in her body tense, her mind raced, recalling every plan she had secretly imagined during years of captivity, every tiny detail she had memorized about the house. Today, she would put all that preparation to use. Breath. The men were distracted, flustered by the noise outside and by each other. One of them ran toward a door, shouting at the others to check the windows. He glances around in desperation. She moved silently, her steps light and deliberate. She kept her eyes on the path she had memorized, avoiding loose floorboards and areas where the men might notice her. Each second felt like an eternity, each breath a test of courage. She whispered to herself, "Stay calm. You can do this." Outside, Daniel stayed near the edge of the property, guiding the police over the phone. But he had to remain hidden, keeping the men unaware that help was so close. His hands were steady, but his heart raced. Every time he heard a shout from inside the house, he froze, fearing the worst for the young woman whose faint cry had drawn him here. He trusted the authorities to act, but he also trusted something else. That Amara was strong, that she had survived so much already, and would continue to survive today.
Amara reached the first door she had carefully noted for weeks.
She had memorized its lock, the way it clicked, and the moment when the men's attention was furthest away.
Her hands moved swiftly but quietly, unlocking the door and pushing it open just enough to slip through.
Breath. Outside, the early morning air felt sharp and bright on her skin. She inhaled slowly, letting the light and fresh air fill her lungs, grounding herself in reality for the first time in years. The garden outside was small but enough to provide cover. She crouched low, moving behind bushes and patches of grass, avoiding the line of sight from the windows and doors. Brace. Every step had to be precise. She could hear the men shouting behind her, realizing something was wrong, but they were still confused, still disorganized.
Amara's mind focused solely on moving forward, one careful step at a time toward freedom.
The police had begun surrounding the house, approaching from all sides. They had been briefed by Daniel, and now they moved with quiet precision. Amara spotted them through a small gap in the fence. Relief surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to make it to them safely, not just escape the men inside the house. She moved faster, her small frame darting through the shadows, keeping low and silent. One of the men appeared in her path, shouting, "Stop her!" Adrenaline shot through her body. She ducked behind a tree just in time, holding her breath as he passed. Her heart hammered, but she refused to panic. Every fear she had held for years was still there, but now it was joined by hope and determination. She reminded herself that this was the moment she had waited for, the moment when years of patience and careful planning could finally pay off. Daniel spotted her from across the yard and signaled to the officers. Amara's eyes met his for just a brief instant, and in that look an unspoken understanding passed between them. He was there. Help was here. She was not alone. She took a deep breath and sprinted the last few meters, her feet barely touching the ground. The officers quickly reached her, guiding her to safety. Wrath speaking in calm voices, helping her regain some sense of control after the years of terror. For a moment, she just stood there, trembling, unable to fully comprehend that she was free.
The men were being restrained, their confusion and anger mingling with the certainty that their control was broken. Amara's world had shifted completely in a few short moments.
She had survived, but the reality of her ordeal was just beginning to sink in. The officers spoke gently, asking her questions, making sure she was unharmed physically. She nodded silently, her mind still trying to catch up with her body. Daniel stayed close but at a safe distance, letting the officers take the lead.
When he finally approached her, she looked up at him, tears streaming down her face.
"You heard me?" she whispered, barely believing that someone had really heard her after all those years of silence.
Daniel nodded, his expression serious but kind. "Yes," he said softly.
"I heard you, and I promised you help."
His words were simple, but to Amara they felt like a lifeline, a confirmation that hope could be real, even after so much darkness. The journey to safety continued slowly. She was escorted to an ambulance where she received care and attention. Doctors and nurses checked her thoroughly, treating minor injuries and ensuring she was physically okay. Every touch, every gentle word reminded her that she was finally in a world where people cared about her, a world where she could breathe freely without fear. Even the small act of someone offering water felt miraculous after years of deprivation and neglect. As the authorities conducted interviews and gathered evidence, Amara began to speak quietly about her experiences. Brasp. She didn't go into every detail, her mind still shielded her from the most painful memories, but she described enough to help them understand the severity of the situation. Her voice was soft, trembling at times, but there was strength in it. Strength born of survival, of courage, of refusing to let fear control her life completely. Over the next few hours, she was taken to a safe location, a place designed to help survivors begin their healing. She was given food, clothing, and a bed that was hers alone. The first time in years she could sleep without fear of being watched or controlled. The room was small but bright, with sunlight streaming through the windows. She sat by the window, staring outside at the world she had longed for. The air smelled of freedom, of life, and of possibility.
Amara's thoughts turned to her family. She had worried endlessly about what they might think, whether they would forgive themselves for not protecting her, and whether they had even been searching for her all this time.
Desperate. Now, though, she felt a cautious optimism. She knew that reunion would come, that her mother and father would see her again, and that she would finally be able to hold them in her arms. The thought gave her a small, fragile sense of peace amidst the storm of emotions. Daniel visited briefly, checking to make sure she was okay. They spoke softly, not needing many words. His presence alone was comforting, a reminder that some people in the world could hear a cry, understand it, and act without hesitation. Amara felt a deep gratitude for him, for the moment he had listened when no one else did, for the courage he showed in taking action. His quiet support helped her feel less alone in the overwhelming aftermath of her ordeal. The officers and social workers explained the next steps. They reassured her that the men who had held her captive would face justice, that her safety was the priority, and that she would have support every step of the way. For the first time in years, Amara felt a sense of control over her life returning. She realized that she could begin to make choices again. Small at first, what to eat, where to sleep, how to spend her day, but choices nonetheless. Even in the safety of her new surroundings, the weight of the years she had endured pressed on her. Memories of fear, Isolation and pain would not disappear instantly, but the knowledge that she had survived, that she had reached out and been heard, gave her a foundation on which to rebuild. She understood that recovery would be a journey, but one she was ready to take, step by step. At night, lying in a bed that was hers alone, she thought about the 3 years she had survived. She thought about the countless small victories, the moments when she had stayed silent to protect herself, the times she had hidden, the days she had planned, waited, and endured. She realized that even in the darkest corners of her life, she had never completely given up. That spark of hope, fragile but unbroken, had guided her to freedom. By the next morning, she was already beginning to plan small steps for the future. She wanted to see her family, to reconnect with friends, and to return to some semblance of normal life. But more than that, she wanted to share her story, not the painful details, but the truth that even in the worst circumstances, courage, hope, and patience could survive. She wanted others to know that being brave was not about fighting back with strength alone, but about enduring, surviving, and believing that help could come.
Amara understood that the road ahead would not be easy.
There would be challenges, reminders of the past, and moments of fear. But she also understood that she had already faced the unimaginable and had survived. The world outside, with all its freedom and light, was waiting for her. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt ready to step into it. Amara woke up in the morning with sunlight streaming through the window, gentle and warm, a stark contrast to the dark rooms where she had spent so many years. She blinked, took a deep breath, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time: safety. It was not just the absence of danger, but the presence of a world where she could think, move, and choose freely. Birds outside, the distant hum of cars, the rustle of leaves, felt alive, as if the world itself was welcoming her back.
In the days that followed, Amara began to take her first careful steps toward healing.
The social workers and counselors helped her understand that recovery was not a straight line. Some days would be easier, some harder. But the important thing was to take one step at a time.
She started keeping a journal again, filling it with memories, reflections, and small thoughts that reminded her of who she was and who she wanted to become.
Writing, she realized, had always been her safe place, and now it could guide her toward rebuilding her life. Visits from Daniel were brief at first, but meaningful.
But he didn't overwhelm her with questions or advice. He simply offered support and presence, a reminder that there were people in the world who cared deeply about her. Sometimes they would sit in silence, sipping tea or watching the sunrise, and in those quiet moments, Amara felt a sense of normalcy returning. It was a strange feeling at first, almost foreign, but she welcomed it. For the first time in years, she could simply be herself. Her first reunion with her family was both joyful and emotional. Her mother's tears fell freely as she held Amara close, whispering apologies and promises that they would never leave her side again. Her father's voice trembled as he spoke, unable to find the words to express relief and gratitude. Her brother, back from college unexpectedly, stayed quiet at first, then knelt to embrace her, promising to protect her in every way he could. Amara felt a mixture of emotions: love, relief, and a lingering sorrow for the years she had lost. Yet she also felt the strength that had carried her through her ordeal, the same strength that had allowed her to survive in captivity. Slowly, she began returning to the routines of life, starting with small things. She went for walks in the park, feeling the grass beneath her feet and the sun on her skin. She visited the library, sitting among the books she had once loved, letting herself feel normal again. These small acts, though simple, were powerful. They were her reclaiming the world, piece by piece, and learning that life could still hold beauty, laughter, and joy even after deep suffering. Counseling became a steady part of her life. Amara learned to talk about her feelings, to name her fears, and to express the trauma she had endured. The sessions were difficult at first. Memories surfaced that she had buried deep within herself. But over time, she began to see them not just as pain, but as evidence of her courage, her resilience, and her ability to endure the impossible. Every story she told, every word she wrote or spoke, became a step toward freedom, not just physical, but emotional and mental as well.
Amara also started helping herself in small practical ways.
She cooked meals, organized her room, and took care of her health. These tasks, ordinary as they seemed, became symbols of independence. They reminded her that she had control over her life again, that she could make choices and create comfort for herself. Each day she grew stronger, more confident, and more certain that she could build a future where fear no longer dictated her every move. The legal proceedings against the men who had held her captive were long and challenging. Amara attended some sessions with support from counselors and her family. Seeing justice unfold, knowing that the people who had caused her so much suffering were held accountable, gave her a sense of closure. It did not erase the past, but it reminded her that the world could recognize wrongs and take steps to correct them. She realized that justice, though imperfect, could exist alongside healing.
Amara also discovered a new purpose: helping others.
She began volunteering in programs for survivors of abuse, speaking quietly to those who were still finding their voices. She shared her story, not to dwell on the pain, but to inspire hope and courage. Her words reminded others that even in the darkest moments there could be light, that survival was possible, and that asking for help was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. Through helping others, Amara found her own healing deepen, and a sense of empowerment she had never imagined before began to grow. Her relationships, too, slowly blossomed. Brands who had worried about her returned, offering support, laughter, and companionship. She reconnected with neighbors and teachers, building connections that were gentle and caring. Trust, she realized, had to be rebuilt carefully, and she took her time. But every positive interaction, every small act of kindness reminded her that the world was not only a place of danger, but also a place of support, care, and community. One quiet afternoon, Amara returned to the park where she had once imagined her freedom. She walked slowly along the path, feeling the breeze against her face, listening to the laughter of children playing nearby. She remembered the fear she had carried for so long and compared it to the calm she felt now. She realized that her strength had not only survived but grown stronger. The years of suffering had forged in her a resilience that could not be taken away.
Amara began writing again, filling pages with stories, reflections, and lessons learned.
Her writing was no longer just an escape. It became a tool of empowerment, a way to make sense of her experiences and share hope with others. She imagined a future where her stories could inspire courage, where her words could reach those who felt lost, alone, or trapped. Through writing, she found a voice that was powerful, confident, and filled with purpose. Even on difficult days, when memories of captivity returned unexpectedly, Amara remembered the small victories that had carried her through. She remembered the careful planning, the whispered words, and the quiet determination that had allowed her forbidden cry to be heard. She remembered the moment Daniel had seen her, the presence of the police, and the first step she had taken into sunlight. Those memories were proof that hope could survive, even in the darkest corners of life. But months turned into years, and Amara grew into a woman who understood the power of resilience, courage, and hope. She pursued her dreams once more, studying subjects she loved and exploring opportunities she had once imagined only in her mind. She formed strong friendships, deepened family bonds, and built a life that was her own. The past remained a part of her, but it no longer controlled her. She had reclaimed her life, piece by piece, and learned to move forward with strength and dignity. Amara also embraced the role of advocacy. She spoke at schools, community centers, and survivor programs, sharing her story of courage and hope. She reminded listeners that survival was possible, that even in the worst circumstances, one could endure, plan, and eventually reach freedom. Her voice became a symbol, a light in the darkness for those still struggling, showing them that life could be rebuilt and strength could grow even after immense hardship. One day, as she sat in her favorite quiet corner of the library writing yet another story, she realized just how far she had come. She was free. Free. She was strong. She was no longer a prisoner of fear or circumstance. And more than that, she had transformed her pain into power, her survival into a path that could guide and inspire others. She understood that life would always have challenges, but she had learned that courage, patience, and hope could carry a person through the impossible. Amara smiled softly, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She thought of the years she had survived, the forbidden cry that had been heard, and the people who had believed in her when hope seemed impossible. She knew that her journey was not just about survival. It was about living fully, embracing freedom, and using her voice to make a difference. The past had shaped her, but it did not define her. Breath. She was free, she was empowered, and she was ready for everything the future held. And in that moment, she felt a quiet certainty, a peace that had once seemed unattainable, that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had already proven her strength. She had endured the unimaginable, been heard, and reclaimed her life. And now, nothing could take away the courage and hope that had carried her through the darkness.